upon a time there was a pretty fly. He had a pretty wife, this pretty fly. But one day she flew away, flew away. She had two pretty children, but one night these two pretty children flew away into the sky, into the
The Night of the Hunter, written in 1952 by Davis Grubb. Book 4, A Strong Tree with Many Birds. She was old and she was ageless, in the manner of such staunch country widows. Gaunt, plain-spoken, and hard of arm, she could stand up to 3 of the toughest, shrewdest cattle dealers in Pleasant County and get every penny she thought her hog was worth. Or if pork was off that year, she would butcher and can her own sausage and smoke her own hams and have enough left over to present the preacher's family with a nice meal of spare ribs. In the summer, she sent the children into the woodlands and brush filth with buckets for berries, and it was her old, wise hands that taught their young fingers how to pick them and schooled their eyes in the ways of berry finding. She had a cow, and she churned her own butter and sold it at New Economy, wrapped in cool, damp swaths of immaculate muslin. She had chickens, and their eggs went to market too, in a bright yellow basket spread across with a napkin. From the fat of her butchered hog she made soap, standing in a drenching March rain beside her brawling iron kettle in the backyard till the task was done. 15 miles downriver at Parkersburg, a waitress had shortchanged her, and that was a quarter of a century before, and she had never gone to that town again. Widowed a full 40 years before, she had raised a son and seen him off into the world, but she had soon grown lonely in the haunted stillness of the old home, and so there had never been a time in a quarter of a century since that her house had not sheltered a child. And children were easy to come by in the river's land. Many a dark-haired farm girl lost her wits to an August moon and the mouth of a cunning lover, and found herself, after he had gone away to work at Pittsburgh or Detroit, with the fruit of their ecstasy, squalling and unwelcome in her poor mother's kitchen. Once the child was weaned and toddling, it was to Rachel Cooper's door that he was carried, like as not, and there was never the bad word uttered for what he was, poor little woods colt. On Sundays, his mother might come for a visit and walk with him in the fields, and at sundown he would be returned to Rachel's bed and board, unprotesting. She fed her children till they were rosy and full, scrubbed them till they were red and squalling, spanked them when there was cause, and taught them the Lord's tale on Sabbath mornings. That very summer, she had packed her ugly cardboard suitcase and gone to Chillicothe to visit her own boy, Ralph, who was 43 now and doing well in real estate and married with a nice wife and 4 grown girls of his own. But the years had improved Ralph. Prosperity had given him a taste for Oriental rugs and expensive modernistic furniture and a big new Victrola, and truth to tell, he and his wife Clarice had been embarrassed by the old woman's visit. She was really no one you would want to show off. That tough, ruddy old woman with the country smell, still strong in her shawl, and her hands all broken and red from laundry lye. She had stayed with them 3 days and fretted and growled at them for having so many forks at each place at supper, and she chased the little Negro maid away from her bedroom each morning and made her bed herself. And when Ralph's boss and his wife came to dinner unexpectedly that night, she had sat afterwards on a straight chair in the farthest corner and laughed at the wrong times and picked nervously at her fingers and acted such a perfect fool that she could have killed herself with self-reproach. She took the noon bus for home next day and had ridden out of that strange town furiously angry at something or someone in the world that had made her feel so coarse and out of date. Clarice had not liked the stone pitcher of maple syrup she had brought in her basket of gifts for them, nor the mason jar of cucumber pickles, nor the green tomato relish. Rachel felt certain that they had thrown these things away after she got on the Greyhound bus and rode away, waving her little handkerchief at them, the fancy one that she never used and always kept in her bureau drawer under the little cloth bag of dried rose petals, mincing and smiling at them from the bus window, trying to act like a lady Ralph would be proud of calling his mother, and then grumbling and quarreling with herself all the way home because she had even cared, because she had even tried to put on a show. And then when the big bus hissed to a stop at the crossroads, she got out and thanked the driver and stood alone in the river wind, in the country silence, and smelled her house down the road, smelled her little orchard, and smelled her good black land, and that was when she felt grand. Old surge had come back in her heart. Ralph was gone from her house, gone from her thoughts, and that was the way life was meant to be. And then she heard the 3 little girls come screaming and shouting towards her across the field, and she thought, why, shoot, it don't matter. I got new harvest coming on, a new crop. I'm good for something in this old world, and I know it too. They had a wild, happy supper together that night. She sent home the neighbor woman who had stayed with the children in her absence, and then she got busy fixing the things she knew they all liked. She even opened a jar of watermelon preserves, and the children knew that this was indeed special. This treat never appeared except at Thanksgiving or Christmastide. She had brought them each small presents from the Chillicothe 5 and 10, and after supper everyone opened her gift and screamed and squealed with joy and kissed the old woman until her lips began to purse and pout with impatience, and she shoved them gruffly away and shook her shoulders angrily lest they discover in her face all the love that was truly there. There were 3, the children: Mary, the youngest, child of a half-breed Cherokee harvest hand from Petting County, and a waitress in the Empire Eats at New Economy. Mary was 4, with raven black hair, as straight as a mare's tail, and eyes like dark little pools of stump water. Clara, 11, and thin as a rail, with the smile of one who had not been smiling long, a thin, aimless child with freckles like bits of butter floating in the churn, with crooked teeth and foolish rag doll eyes. Ruby, 13, and big and shapeless, and stooped from being with the other smaller ones so much and trying always to be down there sharing their world with them, not missing a trick. Ruby was Rachel's problem girl. She broke the mason jars when Rachel set her to scalding them at canning time. She broke the warm brown eggs with her big wooden fingers, gathering them from their cool, secret hiding place about the yard. She tripped on milk pails full and sent them splashing, and yet when her hands touched a little child, she was transformed, and her eyes shone until, like lamps, they illuminate the pale, ugly flesh of her face. And so when old Rachel would go to prayer meetings on Wednesday, she left the girl with the other 2, little Mary and Clary. And when she returned, she would find those 2 on the floor at the red, naked feet of the strange girl, reciting little bits of psalm Rachel had taught them, all by winter lamplight, or playing cat's cradle with the length of butcher's twine. and this was the house of Rachel Cooper, a strong tree with branches for many birds. And so the coming of two more did not make much of a difference. They were children, and they were hungry, and they needed love and a bath and a spanking, and sometimes Rachel would think when she looked at them, any of them, "Deed to God, sometimes I feel like I'm playing a big joke on the Lord. Why, when he comes looking for old folks, he won't even see me. He'll see them kids, and maybe he'll just pass on by and say, 'Why, shoot, that there's a mother. I can take her.'" At night when they were in bed, she would come down and stand in the kitchen for a spell and think, "It's my last harvest, my gathering of summer's best and last sowing." To John, she was a perfect and agonizing enigma, an unfathomable mixture of female authority and the tenderest motherliness. He loathed her those first few days and spoke not one single word of answer or request or denial to her in all that time. Sullenly, stubbornly, tragically, the boy submitted to her disquieting scrub brush, her fierce, unflagging ministrations to his long, untended hair, her spankings when it came his turn to receive them. When she gathered the children about her once a week on the grave, sweet Sunday dusk with the harvest moon hung full, blown as the chilled fresh melon on the hills above the river, arrayed them on little square carpet stools about her in a semicircle, and read them a story from the scripture, John remembered only the voice of salvation that he had left screaming and frothing among the cattails on the river shore upon that dreadful night of their exodus. "John, you hain't heard a word I said." He did not lower his eyes from the lamp, did not move his hands from his knees. He might have been carved from a pine for all this movement. And then she knew it would be wise to let him be and not try to speak to him too much or to make him answer, knowing in her wisdom that the dark, frightened bird that crouched shivering and hurt in the deep forest of his mind would one day poke its bright eyes through the leaves, and presently, if she paid no special notice, it might hop out onto a limb, and then they would all hear it singing brightly and boldly some afternoon, and only then would they turn and pretend to be surprised and welcome it to their picnic cloth. Pearl in that autumn was so hungry for love that she would have turned and taken suck from an old ewe. And soon she had edged little Mary over just a mite to share in the old woman's most favorite and tender partiality. Pearl adored Rachel, and it was a devotion scarcely less than that she felt toward the girl Ruby. Ruby took complete charge the night the strange new children first slept under Rachel's roof. John rebelled when she attempted to undress him for bed, and Rachel intervened, but it was Ruby who held Pearl in her arms until she was asleep and could be laid trusting and smiling, thumb tucked between her pouting sweet lips, beneath the cool, fresh sheets of the old spool bed in Rachel's attic room. John lay awake beside his sister that night in the perfect agony of misgivings. He had not felt such rejection of his fortunes, even in the darkest days, where Preacher had put his first appearance at Cressup's Landing. It was not that he believed old Rachel might be in league with the blue men who had dragged off his father, or even with the insane evangelist. This was curiously worse. It was as if some unutterable and beguiling way Rachel schemed against the very identity of him. John had grown so accustomed to the climate of flight and danger, and to the clear definition of life's mortal enemies, that somehow Rachel's goodness seemed more darkly perilous than any of the others. And yet, in the time to come, as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks wound like country lanes among the shaking, burning leaves of Indian summer, and the end of harvest was upon the land, it seemed to John that what he had felt that morning on the sandbar when old Rachel had come upon them there, that sense of coming home, might be true. He found that his chafed spirit rankled less and less beneath the stern, wholesome regimen of Rachel's household. One night they were all at the black stove making seafoam candy. Old Rachel and the girls prattling and carrying on over the buttered tins where the candy pieces were to be spread to cool. He sat apart from them, alone on the back stoop in the crisp air, under the moon in the black walnut tree beyond the wash house. He had almost thought for a moment that he would like to go indoors and stand close to them, not to say anything because he could not speak yet, but just to stand, to be one of them, perhaps to touch the old woman with his hand, to let her know that the broken bird in the dark trees stirring its wings and try them as already thought of the morning when it would venture upon those outer limbs and try its voice upon the stillness. On the night when Rachel read to them from the Bible about Moses, he had been moved even more. "Now old Pharaoh, he was the king of Egypt land," she cried, spreading her hard old hands across the tissue-thin pages of the scriptures. "And he had a daughter, and once upon a time she was walking along the river, and she seen something bumping and a-scraping along down on a bar under the willows, back in the cattails, where the devil's darning needles was flashing in the morning sun. And do you know what it was, children?" "No," gasped Ruby and Clary and little Mary, and even hearing them, Pearl cried out too. "Well now, it was skiff washed up on the bar," whispered the old woman, her black eyes twinkling in the light of the kitchen lamp. "And who do you reckon was in it?" "Pearl and John," cried poor big Ruby. "Not this time," cried Rachel. "It was just one young'un, a little boy babe. And do you know who he was, children?" "No," cried Ruby and Clary and little Mary and Pearl in a single voice. "Well, it was Moses, a king of men. Moses, children, that was to grow up to lead his people out of the wilderness, to save them all from death and pestilence and plague." John heard it and came to them at last, drawn irresistibly by this tale that was so completely his own, and sat boldly in the circle beside Ruby's carpet stool, and listened some more, and the old woman wisely paid him no mind. "The river brought the time of gold into the valley. Up in the woods, the hickory nuts rained their dry patter throughout the still afternoons, and there was smoke in the air, and the ghost of Cornstalk and his young martyred princes stalked the land again, and the hunter's gun boomed and racketed in the hollows, and soon the frost would come to blacken the yellow pawpaws." John had come home. The bird was freed and had flown into the sun to return each dusk to its nest. All the love of that house had been too much for him. It was in the butter, in the smell of the clean cloths that Rachel patched and sewn each night where they had torn them, in the odor of the fresh bread on fall afternoons, and in nasal hearty crackle of her impatient voice when she hailed them in for supper. And yet, despite the capitulation, John kept his eyes on the river road and guarded the doll in his sister's arms with unremitting vigilance, harking ever for the clop of that strange horse on the windy midnight highway, for the creak upon the threshold, the whisper of the hunter's steel. Not through any logic, but through a grim and pragmatic cynicism of instinct, John knew within his heart, within his flesh, that the idol would be broken in the end, that upon one day before the snow fell again, he would hear that sweet and faithful voice drifting clear and dreadful through the affrighted autumn dusk. One night, sensing that he might want to talk, Rachel sent the other children off to bed, but kept John with her in the kitchen. She bent her head, squinting through her poor, tapped-up, crayed spectacles at the darning of their tattered stockings under the golden circle of lamplight. "Get ye an apple from the cellar, boy, and get me one, too." He obeyed, pounding down into the cellar, happy that she had kept him up after the others to make this a special time for him alone, to set him upon a chore whose fruits they would both share. He clambered up the side of the great barrel and stretched his fingers deep inside among the chilly, clustered heaps of last year's Macintoshes, and when he had found two without rot or blemish, he scampered back to the kitchen, washed them at the pump, and gave one to Rachel. Now she set her darning gourd abruptly aside, bit crisply into the fruit, and glared at him with that tart, twinkling grimace that he had come to recognize as all the world's safety. "John, where's your folks?" she said suddenly. He lifted his eyes to her and said the word plainly, knowing its awful truth. "Dead." "Dead," she nodded with finality, and let that matter be. "And where are you from?" "Upriver," he said. "A ways." "Well, I know that, John. I didn't figure you rowed that John boat up from Parkersburg. Have ye any kin?" He shrugged. "Kin," she repeated. "No uncles? No aunts? No grandfolk?" "I don't know," he said. Far up in the dark, above the house, above the world, the vast locust voices began their insonant, rackety skirl. And suddenly, and with a tenderness that night broke the old woman's heart, John reached out his hand and laid his fingers on her knuckles. "Tell me that story again." "Story, honey? Why, what story?" "About them kings," he said, "that queen found down on the sandbar in the skiff that time." "Kings?" she scolded. "Why, honey, there was only one." "Oh, no," he said. "I mind you said there were two." "Well, shoot, maybe there was. Just come to think of it, there was two, John." And she fetched the old Bible and read him the tale again in a soft, gruff voice, because she did not dare let him see how she felt just then, and changed the story around so that there were really two in the bulrushes in the basket in the lost and ancient time. "Now get to bed now," she cried at last, rising with anger, moist eyes, and smacked his bottom smartly before her as he fled up the kitchen steps. "Get to bed now, and no nonsense. Gracious, it's nigh 8 o'clock, and we've all got to be up tomorrow bright and early to fetch them eggs and butter to town." He lay in bed that night, hearing a strange steamboat blow softly down somewhere under the lower stars, and he thought for the first time, well, maybe he won't come at all now, and maybe it wasn't none of it real, and maybe there wasn't even any mom and dad, or none of it, and I asked a lost king, and Pearl is the lost king, too. The trip to New Economy with the week's butter and eggs was the great event toward which each of the 7 other days moved. Upon this day, Rachel dressed each of them in his best, and together they went to the river landing, where the old ferry boat made its dozen daily trips to the Ohio side. At this ferry landing, there stood an ancient locust tree, upon which hung on a leather thong nail in the bark was a battered brass bugle. More times than not, the ferry captain dozed with a Western magazine over his face up in the cabin of the rickety little gasoline boat, and it was the custom of travelers on the other side to wake him with the bugle to come and fetch them across. Rachel always carried a bit of the fresh, clean muslin she used for straining jelly so that she could wipe off the brass mouthpiece of the bugle that was not uncommonly crusted and bitter with the tobacco juice of its previous user. "Dirtiest critters under God's blue sky, man!" she would scold, and then lift the horn to her mouth to blow a lusty, impatient trump across the glassy, silent stream. In New Economy, they had a good restaurant meal at the Empire Eats, and when the day's trading was done, and if their produce had brought a good price, Rachel would take them to Eves Roberts' pharmacy and treat them all to an enormous communal sack of licorice drops and sometimes even ice cream sodas. Then it was back to the ferry again with empty baskets and high spirits and roaring appetites for supper. Folks turned on the streets to stare after Rachel Cooper and her brood. Every woman with children of her own envied the proper, obedient way the children followed the old woman's polka dot skirts. Men, respectful of Rachel's hard, shrewd bargaining sense at the cattle auctions, bowed to her, tipped their hats, spoke words of greeting. When they passed Eve Roberts' bench out in front of the drugstore on their way to the street again the late afternoon, loafers and whittlers had suddenly gathered. "Hi, Miss Cooper." "Well, howdy, Jean. Got 2 more peeps in your brood, I see." "Yes, and ornery than the rest," she said. Don't kids just beat the Dutch now? Just look at them 2 little ones, Pearl and Mary. I'll swear I scrubbed them 2 till they was raw 'fore I come over here this morning. Where you get the new ones, Miss Cooper?" "Oh, driftwood," she said, "just plain driftwood washed up on the bar." And then she could have cut her tongue out for saying that, for letting those loose-jawed scallywags know anything about those 2. 9 chances out of 10 that boy John had fibbed to her about having no folks, and next time she knew some WPA family would come rattling and banging up in the yard in a busted-down fruit truck and claim their 2 lost biddies and light in Rachel for kidnapping them in the first place. Rachel bit her tongue angrily and hurried the children toward the ferry. Sure as sin, some father would show his face in town, and those gossips would tell. And sure as sin, he would come a-hunting his kids. As a matter of fact, it was not 3 days later that the stranger with the funny hands bought Ruby an ice cream soda and a movie magazine in Ev Roberts' pharmacy, and told her what pretty eyes she had. That summer, Rachel had arranged for Ruby to learn sewing from Granny Blackensop, an aged widowed seamstress who lived with her daughter across the river at New Economy. Each Thursday evening, Rachel tied up a 50-cent piece in the girl's handkerchief and gave her 2 dozen eggs tuition in a yellow basket. Then she took her to the ferry landing and saw her safely on board the little boat, which was to be met on the Ohio side by Granny Blackensop's middle-aged and unmarried daughter, Nevada. At 9, Rachel would come back to the landing to meet the girl. It seemed to her that nothing in this procedure could permit the disastrous encounter between Ruby and any of the honorary farm boys and evening loafers who lounged on the bench in front of Eve Roberts' drugstore. Yet the first night Nevada Blankenshop was to meet Ruby at the New Economy landing, she was in fact overcome in her bedroom after 2 tumblers of her mother's dandelion wine, and so Ruby had stood in bewilderment on the alien bricks and pondered what she was supposed to do next. Was the purpose of the meaning of her missions there might be? It was something Rachel wanted her to do. It was something she was supposed to learn that would make her a better girl. Through the branches of the chestnut trees along Water Street, she saw the bright lights of New Economy. She heard the drifting random sounds of men's easy voices and the music of a radio and the noise of an occasional flivver. Now, as she moved into the glitter of pike streaks, things began happening. The night above her was filled with golden, windy wires of light and stars that winked off on like enormous sweet fireflies. The men on the evening bench saw her then, the whittlers and the tale-tellers and the watch traders and the killers of time, and Ruby had found the world. Rachel never knew. The eggs and the baskets were often forgotten in the sweet, breathless scuffle down the road berm under the pawpaw leaves, and when Ruby got off at the West Virginia landing, she would be empty-handed, and Rachel would think, "Well now, if Granny Blackensop don't have her nerve keeping my very best egg basket." Ruby lived for those Thursdays. She had found a wonderful thing that she could do well, something that never went wrong like gathering eggs did, like washing jars did, because there was nothing to drop, to break, to spill, to forget. And on the dozen occasions that Nevada Blankensop had actually been there to meet her and take her up to the house, fusty and thick with the smell of old woman's sleep, Ruby had squirmed and twitched her buttocks on the split-bottom chair the whole time of the sewing lesson, heeding not a smidgen of it, learning not a single twinkling stitch. One night, she had lain in her bed in perfect trance of yearning and thought desperately, I just can't wait till Thursday, because that's 5 sleeps away. I'll steal the money from Rachel's sugar bowl and go there tonight to the river. But she had been afraid to do that and waited anyway, and that Thursday night Nevada had the vapors and was not there to meet her, and she had fairly run to the place in the street in front of the drugstore where the eyes of the evening loafers awaited her. Hey, that's her right yonder, whispered Micaiah Blake to the stranger, nudging him and pointing to the girl moving down the street. That's Ruby, and I reckon she'd be able to tell you what you want to know about them 2 new ones Rachel took in here a while back. The stranger had appeared in New Economy that afternoon and hitched his horse to the iron courthouse fence and wandered away while the mare munched and tore the unattended grass. At dusk, he had sought out the evening loafers and told them the story that he had repeated in 100 dusty crossroad gatherings until it could say it now by rote. How he was a preacher of the gospel looking for his no-account wife who had run off with a drummer, and how his 2 blessed children had gotten lost in the scuffle. He told them how he had gone a-hunting and a-wandering through the bottomlands all that summer, and how he had tracked down 12 lost lambs and none of them his. A little boy and a little girl with a doll? Yes, thought Micaiah Blake, that was them. But she would know for sure, that bad girl Ruby, and it was Thursday, and chances were she'd come over to town tonight. The others moved away from him with the disgust he seemed to arouse everywhere now, all but Micaiah Blake, and he stayed to point Ruby out as she came to stand before the assemblage of them, waiting in the dusk up Pike Street with her big shoes close together and her fingers locked around the basket handle. You're Ruby, ain't you, my child? He had come right over to her, had not sidled up as the others always did, sneaking as sheep, killing dogs. This itched her curiosity. He was older than them, too, and stronger somehow, and his eyes were strange, handsome and old and cruel as Herod. Ruby, I like to talk to you, my dear. Yes, she said, yes, I will if you will buy me a chocolate soda. What? You'll what? And the evening loafers were all laughing and catcalling again, as she knew suddenly that she would do it for him, for nothing, because he was just so wonderful. Watch out, preacher. She'll drag you down in the dust right there in the middle of Pike Street if you don't watch her. He turned and glared at them. Shut your dirty mouths, he boomed across the stillness. Shut 'em. So she waited, smiling at him, loving his grand, manly sternness, basking happily in his anger and the violence she could feel like the warmth of a radiant stove against her body. I want to ask you a question, girl, and if you'll answer me God's truth, I'll buy you whatever it is you want. A chocolate soda, she repeated, and he took her into the drugstore, and Eve Roberts' nephew waited on them, and while Preacher watched her, seething with impatience, she began to eat. Now it's time for you to keep your share of the bargain, he said. Will you tell me? But without answering, she slid from the wire chair at the table and wandered off with wanton swaying hips to the magazine rack and stood with the basket still heavy against her thigh and leafed through a new movie magazine and thought how beautiful she must be. Will you tell me? Buy me this, she smiled, her small eyes shrewd and bargaining, and he cried, all right, all right, all right, and went to lay the money on the marble and came back to her side, waiting, glaring with choking impatience into the pale pink gums of her wanton mouth. Ain't I purty? She said suddenly, and he smiled and relaxed then, knowing how he could get her. Why, you're the purtiest gal I've ever seen in all my wanderings. 'Deed, I've never seen such purty eyes in all my born days. Didn't no one never tell you that, Ruby?" "No," she breathed hoarsely. "No one never did." And then she danced over to the big brown mirror over the soda fountain and grimaced coquettishly at the image behind it. He came and brought her back to the table and made her sit and finish the soda while he told her some more about her pretty eyes. And when the soda was gone, the last of the sweetness sucked through the gurgling straws, he made her give him the movie magazine until she had kept her share of the bargain. "Two little young'uns," he said. "There's two new ones over at your place, ain't there, Ruby?" She nodded dumbly. "What's their names?" he whispered, bending closer. "Pearl and John." "Ah, and when did they come to live at your house?" She frowned, recollecting. "Oh, this summer." She nodded again. "And is there a doll? Is there a doll anywhere that either of them?" "Pearl," she said, "she has a doll, only she won't never let me play with it. She won't let none of us kids play with it, and Miss Cooper says us to leave her alone because it's hers." "Ah, yes, Pearl and John," she said again pointlessly, and belching softly and tasting the soda again, and staring longingly at the movie magazine he held away from her. "Ruby?" "Yes, sir?" "Not a word of this pow-pow to Miss Cooper, eh? That's part of our bargain, eh?" And she smiled and nodded, and he gave her the movie magazine again. And when he said good night and began to walk away, she sprang to her feet and followed him. And when he felt her fingers on his shoulder, his face turned, already writhing with disgust and fury. "What do you want now?" She lifted her mouth and whispered in his ear. "What?" "Don't you want to?" she mumbled. "You can if you want to." "Get away from me!" He thrust her heavily away and walked rapidly out into the street, past the evening loafers, striding furiously through the dust toward his horse, choking and cursing, his mouth gasping with nausea. In the doorway, she stood for a moment, watching his receding figure. The golden neon caught the color of paper flowers above her face, and she thought, "He's not like them." She moved past the men on the evening bench, hurrying towards the river with the basket of eggs swinging on her arm, not turning at their cats' calls and whistles. "He is not like them," she kept on thinking, and the ferry boat lamp shone like a piece of moon through the elms, and she knew that the night was gone, and she hugged the movie magazine against her breast, thinking, "He's not like them. He is different, and next time I am with him, I will make him want to, and I won't even ask him to buy me an ice cream soda or the movie magazine again." After Rachel found the movie magazine under Rachel's skirt, the night she took it out from her, Ruby sat on the straight-back chair by the kitchen door and wept soundlessly in her big fingers. After a while, she took her hands away from her face and let the great tears squeal slowly from her quivering lids. Rachel sat opposite her on the canning bench, scowling at the girl in troubled speculation and massaging the yellow soles of her bare feet. She was sure now Ruby had been with a man. It was a swift country knowing, a realization that swept over the old woman in choking dismay. "Now, Ruby, stop your weeping and look at me square in the eye and answer me." The puffed red lids opened and stared. "Ruby." "Yes'm." "Ruby, you didn't have no money to buy that movie book, did ya?" "No'm. But I never took nothing from your sugar bowl, Miss Cooper. You just know I wouldn't steal nothing of yours." "Now I know you wouldn't, child. I'm not accusing you of that. Just tell me the truth. Where'd you get the money to get that there book?" "But you'll whip me." "Shoot, when did I ever? You've been spanked by me, and you may again, but you never got a whipping after the day you walked over my threshold. Just tell me, Ruby, there hain't nothing to fear." "He give it to me," she babbled. "He said." "Who?" "The man down at the drugstore." "I see. You was at the drugstore, and this here man?" "Oh, he was a nice man," said the girl. "He said my eyes was the purtiest things." "Pshaw now, and whoever said they weren't? You're a beautiful young girl, Ruby, and that's the very reason I don't want nothing happening to you." Now the old woman, roused and fidgety with anger at the world's trifling men, fetched her tiny can of brown snuff from the table, shook a smidgen into the lid, dropped it daintily in her lower lip beneath the gums. "Miss Cooper," said Ruby, snuffling and bending forward, her face aglow now with the new ecstasy of confession. "I've been bad." "Well, how, Ruby?" "Miss Cooper," the girl continued, her face illuminated, "I never went to old Miss Blankensop's all them times." "Well, where did you go, child?" "Miss Cooper, I done it with men." "Yes, ma'am, I done what they asked me to." "Dear God, child, with men? Was there more than one?" And that loosed it all, and the girl told it all in spilling babble about the Thursday nights when she had not been at the seamstress's house at all, about the boys that had taken her down to the river roads in fruit trucks, in family jalopies, and afoot. She told how at first she thought it was what Rachel had sent her to do, and when she finally found out that this was bad and that she was supposed to be doing something else, it was already too late to stop. And then she burst out crying again, and Rachel joined her, hugging her and rocking gently with her in the lamplight, and they both enjoyed a good female cry together for a spell. And then Ruby told Rachel about Preacher. "But he warn't like them," whispered the girl, "like one who I've seen in a vision. He just bought me a sody and the book, and he said my eyes was the purtiest." "But he must have wanted something, Ruby. A man don't waste his time on a girl unless he gets something." "What?" "He asked about John and Pearl." And Rachel thought, and so it had come as it had come before. Sooner or later, they come back for them and take them away, and it's just like they was to cut a piece of my heart out. "Is he their pap?" Ruby shrugged. "Well, girl, didn't he say?" "No, he just said was that kids, Pearl and John, were living here." "He said that?" "Yes'm." Rachel arose livid with anger, biting her tongue with it. She stomped across the pump, splashed the dipper full, and rinsed the snuff from her gums, spat it out through the open screen door. "Then I'd just like to know why he never come right up to the house together today and showed himself," she cried. "Just come right up like everyone else done in broad daylight and say, 'Those are my young'uns. Much obliged, madam.' Hand 'em over. Shoot, I just plainly can't abide a sneak." "Oh, but he was nice," observed Ruby. "He said my eyes—" "Hush, child, what else did you tell him?" "I said they come to live with us last summer, Pearl and John did." "All right, and then what did he say?" Ruby squinted and stuck her tongue out with a pathetic try at shrewdness, trying to remember how it had been. "Oh, I forget," she said, scratching her head slowly. Rachel glared out in the open window into the black night of autumn. "He'll come a-calling soon enough," she mumbled, hugging her withered breast and rocking gently and thinking, "All the love and worry and fretting like they was my own. I just wonder to God if they know when they come calling to clean them again after they've had their fill of sporting and carrying on and leaving me to mind their kids, to pray over them and wash their bottoms and pick school lice out of their heads and keep their breeches patched. I just wonder if they know what a chunk they're cutting out of me when they come for them at last." "Fool!" she scolded out loud. "Darn old fool!" And she fetched a candle and shooed Ruby before her up the kitchen stairs to bed. Rachel despised all the womenkind that night, including herself. It was Ruby who saw the man on the horse first and dropped 2 brown eggs splattering on the flagstones by the stable. He rode slowly up the path through the meadow from the river road, and Ruby scampered off to the basement where Rachel was setting up the fresh quart jars of apple butter she had canned that week. "It's him!" "Who?" "The man! The man!" "Well, shoot, don't take on like it was the second coming, Ruby. Get on up to the kitchen and put your shoes on. I'll be up and talk with him directly." "Gracious sakes alive, girl, don't act so simple." He tethered his horse to a fence post and walked across the yard toward the back porch, his head cocked slightly, his eyes creased in cautious greeting. "Morning, ladies." Ruby sat suddenly in a rope swing under the apple tree. Rachel stood behind the screen door, her hands folded under her apron in a timeless pose of country women greeting strangers. "How do?" He stood for a moment staring at them, at the old woman and then the girl, and then back to the old woman with a bow. "You're Miss Cooper, I take it." "I am." "Then you're who's I'm looking for, all right, ma'am." Rachel stepped boldly onto the stoop and approached him across the grass. She had forgotten her shoes, and yet her feet, even at her age, were strong and graceful among the plantains and buttercups. "It's about them 2 kids I took in," she said. "That's John and that's Pearl." "And then it's true you have them." "Yes, I have them." His face twitched with emotion, and his voice broke in great thankful sobs. "Oh, my little lambs," he cried, falling to his knees near the feet of the transfixed Ruby. "Oh, Lord, we praise thy name. Oh, sweet, sweet little lambs, and to think I never hope to see them again in all the world. Oh, dear madam, if you was to know what travail, what a thorny crown I have borne in my search for these strayed chicks." Rachel kept her eyes on him, her mouth thin as a string, and suddenly sat down in a warped old rocking chair by the puzzle tree. "Oh, where are they, Miss Cooper? Where are my little lambs?" "They've all went to gather black walnuts," she said, rocking fast in the dark August grass, "up in the woods beyond the Stalnaker place. My other 2 girls, Mary and Clary, are with them." She fixed him still with that stare, her black eyes twinkling like berries, and she thought, "It's right for him to come for them if they his own, but there's something wrong here. There is nothing I can guess by looking at him, but there is definitely something I can feel in my bones, in my skin, in my hair. That is wrong. It's just like I could smell it on the poor dumb girl when she come in last night, and that she had been with men. It's just like I can feel the thunder and rain in my arches and back a whole day before the purple thunderhead comes over the Ohio hills from the west." "Ruby," she said, "go call them kids." Ruby minced primly off, through the tall grass at the edge of the lawn, toward the pasture beyond the woods. Preacher wiped at his tears and his leathery cheeks with the head of his hands. That was when Rachel saw the letters of the hate tattoo and shivered, and the old mother wit worn raced and chatted like scarce mice into the dark cupboards of her mind. He caught her staring and immediately commenced explaining. She listened unmoved, and his rising voice described the war of good and evil in the hearts of men, and his knuckles cracked and squeaked as the hands met and the fingers twined and strove together. "I am a man of God," he said at last. "And them kids," she says, "is yours?" "Oh, my flesh and blood," he said, "my very heart and soul." "Where's your missus?" He bowed his head away from her and bit his lip and stared off into the far rainbow flicker of dragonflies above the puddles in the meadows. "She went the way of temptation," he whispered. "She run off with the drummer one Wednesday night, not an hour before I was to preach at the prayer meeting." "And took them kids with her?" That's strange. If she took them kids, how come? Yes, he said, took them with her. God only knows what unholy sights and sounds those innocent little babes had heard in the den of perdition where she dragged them. But at last it was too much for them. They run off from her. Where's she at? The Lord only knows. The good Lord only knows. And them kids have been running the road since then? Yes, he smiled softly, before Jesus whispered in their little ears and led them to you. Where they run from? I mean, where'd you figure the woman took them when she run away from you? Oh, somewhere downriver, he asked, shaking his head grimly. Parkersburg, maybe, Cincinnati, one of them Sodoms on the Ohio River. Rachel rocked fast and hard, her eyes twinkling and strong in her face. Rot funny, hain't it, she said, how they rode all the way upriver in a 10-foot John boat? Preacher's eyes flashed like summer heat lighting before the night storm. They run north, he said. I've been following them all summer long. I reckon they stole the skiff and coasted down river a spell to keep off the hot roads. Rachel grunted sharply and listened to the flat, pale voice of Ruby hollering and hailing the children against the wind. And now tell me about them, cried Preacher. Are my children well? They're a sight better than when they were when I fetched them up from the mud bank where the river had thrown them. They was a sight to turn body's stomach, ticks in their hair and mud in their shoes, and dirty as shots from head to toe, just skin and bones too, and hungry as hogs. Oh, gracious, gracious, you are such a good woman, Miss Cooper. Now, if you don't mind me asking, Preacher, she said, how are you figuring to raise them two without a woman? Oh, the Lord will provide, he said softly, and stooping chose an apple from a windfall beneath the tree. He tried it with his thumb and bit into it thoughtfully. I don't reckon, he said, they had nothing in the way of worldly possessions except the clothes on their backs. Not much more, snapped Rachel, and they hardly stand another washing. His eyes, hers again swiftly. He glanced like a wolf. The glance moved in a quick, feathery appraisal like the forked tongue of a copperhead. That little Pearl, he crowed softly. Her and the doll of hers kept it with her night and day. She still does, says Rachel, and remembering the day she had tried to get the doll away from the little girl to give it a scrubbing in the morning wash, and John had carried on as bad as she had. And suddenly the children rounded the corner of the wash house in a pell-mell rush of small faces, Ruby towering above them, all like a thistle above buttercups, and the face of the curious Clary and beaming little Mary, and the face of Pearl, just now awakening to the shock of love and remembrance at the sight of Preacher's face. John, Pearl, and Rachel rising. We got company together. Your daddy has come to claim you. For an instant, none of them spoke. None moved. The group seemed frozen like figures in some quaint country tintype of a family reunion. Then Pearl gave a wail of happiness, and dropping the doll in the grass by John's feet, raced to Preacher's arms. He caught her up and kissed her, and his face was twisted again in sorrowful happiness, and he was crying out something about the mercy of the Lord. John stood still and looked straight into the old woman's eyes, and in that instant neither spoke, and yet each told the other 1,000 things. Rachel's eyes holding his and saying, What is it, John? What is wrong about all of it? What is it I can feel the same way I feel the gathering of tomorrow's storm before the west cloud comes? And then she read the dark and awful answer in his eyes. The years alone in the nights of river silence and the river wind had taught her the wisdom of stable beasts, the cunnings of small creatures of the woods. And now while she looked at the boy and listened while Preacher prattled and joked with the little girl, Rachel felt the skin of her back bunch and twist like a hide of frightened mare when something prowls in the midnight yard, and her new fowl bleats with mortal dread. John lowered his eyes from hers, then stared at the doll at his feet. He stooped bravely and gathered it up, loosely silly arms flopping against him. Preacher peered over Pearl's shoulders at him. And there's my little John. And what a day this is. Hallelujah. What rejoicing there must be in heaven just now. Come to me, boy. But John did not move, and the wind blew, and the rope swing stirred gently under the gnarled branch. Rachel's mouth was a slit, her arms folded tight against her gingham bosom, her eyes watching Preacher. Didn't you hear me, boy? Preacher put Pearl down, and he was still smiling. John swallowed and lifted his eyes to the old woman. What's wrong, John? She said. Nothing, he said, smiling unaccountably because he knew how foolish it would all sound if he tried to tell her the truth of things. No, what's wrong, John? She said again, bending to him a little. When your dad says come, you should mind him. Her eyes twinkled, and he read them, and they said, You know this ain't true, and I know it ain't true because there is something going on here that I don't know about, but we must play the game out for a little while till things get cleared. John, she repeated. He ain't my dad, John said and hugged the doll. Preacher's smile was still there, and he came toward the boy, and then Rachel moved between them and stood thinking, and he ain't no preacher neither, because I have seen preachers in my day, and some was saints on earth, and some was crooked as dog hind legs, but this one has got them all beat for badness. John, have a heart. You'll have poor Miss Cooper here thinking I'm an impostor. He turned his head to the little girl and smiled again. Pearl, tell Miss Cooper who I am. Come on now. Pearl bent and pressed her fat knees with her palms and dimples and smiled for them all. Your daddy, she said. Preacher turned to Rachel again and threw up his hands at this proof. There now. You see, the boy's a strange lad. The shock of all of this, the mother running away and all, he's just a little queer. Not so a body would notice, snapped Rachel, not so queer as some I've seen today. And now the woodland mornings cried and skittled louder with her, and she turned and moved, flushed and breathless, towards the wash-house. Miss Cooper, you don't mean to hint you believe this boy? I know him, cried Rachel. A damn sight better than I know you, mister. The lights were there now, plain to see the flickering fire rising behind his veiled eyes. His whole face began to sag suddenly, the smile gone, the whole mask of flesh melting quickly into a sallow leer of unveiled malevolence. Well, they believe me in town, he said, and they'd understand it wasn't my fault if there's going to be any trouble about getting them kids back. Old Rachel ducked inside the wash-house, and John was alone as Preacher moved swiftly towards him. Silently, John scrambled under the puzzle tree and disappeared. Boy, here. Squatting, Preacher peered through the leaves and saw that John had crawled under the low foundation of the wash-house. Preacher rose, dusting off his knees, and looked at them all accusingly. Don't this beat all now? A loving father comes to claim his poor little lost lambs, and one of them acting up this way? Well, I reckon I'll just have to peel off my coat and scrabble in there after him myself. Old Rachel loomed above him, then on the stone threshold, mottled and blue, stained with the sloshing of a half-century's wash-water. The blue barrel of the pump gun was steady as doomed in her old hands. Just march yourself yonder to your horse, mister. Preacher, on all fours beneath the puzzle tree, lifted his face slowly to the gun muzzle and then to Rachel's face. His features were yellow with it now, the raging, uncontrollable fury. You march, mister. I'm not fooling. He staggered to his feet, and she saw that he had a knife open in the palm of his hand, had it out, and even he started under the wash-house after John. Now he backed away from her, bouncing it, lifting it in his palm, the froth seeming to have gathered on his lips, even before he started screaming at her, moving stiffly backward step by step, the bone-handling thing with its bright, winked blade still bouncing in his palm, his whole face suddenly going to pieces in a wash of madness. God damn you! God damn you, I'm going. Yes, I'm going, but I'll come back. God damn you, I'll come back. I'll have that bastard yet. God damn you, I will. You ain't done with Harry Powell yet, you whore of Babylon." Upon this outburst, the children fell back to let him pass under the apple tree on his way to the tethered mare at the fence. His whole body was bent and raked with spasms of the roaring, maniacal rage, the face and wrinkled mask of murder, the knife still bouncing like a carnival toy in his open palm. He led the horse away, shaking too badly to mount it and still screaming, and Rachel followed with the gun to the fence with all her little flock behind her, except for the still hidden John. "I will wait until Almighty God sounds the trump of doomsday," the voice roared across the silent fields. "You'll wish you had never been born when I am done with you. The Lord God Jehovah will guide me to the hiding place of mine enemies. He will guide my hand in vengeance. God damn you. God damn you. I'll come back when it's dark, you devils, you whores of Babylon. Just wait. You wait. Just wait." And through the tranquil innocence of all that smothering autumn afternoon, the voice echoed across the fields, punctuated only by the thud of windfalls beneath the apple trees. When dusk fell, Rachel lit the kitchen lamps and gathered all her lambs above her by the stove and sat with the shotgun across her knee, facing the night in the window. The sun had gone down in a blazing river rainbow in the yellow sky, and it had been dark for only a few moments before the full moon appeared and lit the mists of early evening. They could see how quite distinctly from the kitchen window, sitting on a locust stump at the end of Rachel's garden, his whole body malevolently concentrated and fixed upon the silent farmhouse. Preacher's last siege had begun. Rachel sent the whimpering Ruby off to put the children to bed. John's eyes shone with an unflinching confidence that Rachel would save them. Incredibly, he slept. The moon shone down on the field, and against the pale luminescence of the mist, the old woman fixed her smarting, weary eyes on the black shape of the hunter, thinking, "Dear God, don't let me sleep. Dear God, there is something awful out there in my garden. I've got to keep it from my lambs. Dear God, don't let me sleep." Once her head nodded, and her lids fell for an instant, and catching herself, the old face snapped up, and peering through the deepest mist, she saw that the black shape of the man was still there. Now she thought for an instant that her wits were slipping, that her mind had begun to fail under the strain of the day, and yet the sound was quite distinct, quite unmistakable. He was singing a hymn, leaning on the everlasting arms, and partly because she needed strength from God and partly because it would keep her from hearing the voice, her mouth began to shape the old words too. It seemed that her head had fallen only for a second, and yet when her eyes flew open against the moon had moved from the crooked elbow of the apple tree and swarmed free in the thin mist above the stable. The black figure was gone from the end of the garden, and the old woman thought in the first moment of real fear she had known, "But he won't leave. Now he's up to something. If I had gone away, I would have heard the mare. If he had gone across the river, I would have heard the ferry engine or the bugle at the tree. He's closer now, sneaking in toward the house like a rapid fox with its belly dragging in the corn furies, somewhere out yonder in the corn where I can't see him." She was strong and she was old, and there had been many things that had happened to her through the long years that had made her not so much brave as simply beyond fearing. But Rachel was frightened now, feeling against the hunch and twist of the skin of her neck and shoulders the ancient feral sense of something abroad amongst her flock. While the horse hall clock chimed 3, she gasped for breath and whispered, "Oh, dear merciful God." Then she thought, "I had better fetch them all downstairs, and we will stay here together by the stove till morning, because I was fool and fell asleep for a spell, and even now, if he was to get into the house, I wouldn't know it." She took the lamp to the doorway and the foot of the kitchen stairs and held it into the darkness. "Ah, Ruby! Ruby! Ruby!" An instant later there came a rustle of the straw tick in the room across, and a dry hiss and a pat of the girl's naked feet. "Yes'm. Ruby, get John and Pearl up." Out of bed. Get Clary and Mary up, too. Bring them all down here to the kitchen. Yes, miss'm. I'll do that. And she turned again, and the long shadows stretched like arms below the moving lamp, and she came back to the table and sat down again with a pump gun facing the night window, and thought, how many fools has that devil tricked with his lying, mealy-mouthed gospel and his prayers and his hymn-singing. God, women is such fools, and a widow with kids is the worst fool of all, because she is the most alone and the quickest to cotton to a man like him. The children padded swiftly into the kitchen from the stair door and circled her, wide awake and frightened, and waiting for Rachel to tell them what to do. And looking into their round child faces, she saw all the trust that was there, and bit her tongue with hot, choking rage at the man in the mist. Children, I got lonesome, she snapped directly, and wanted company. I figured we'd start playing some parlor games. Pearl and little Mary jumped up and down, patting their fat palms. Will you tell us a story? Pearl said shyly. I might, said the old woman with a swift, furious glance into the moonlit arena. I might tell a story. And now she saw again in Ruby's face that stunned and simple smile, that glow of sweet wonder that had crept over her since Preacher's appearance in the yard that day. And when the girl saw Rachel looking at her, she asked the question that she had kept in her tossing and burning under the quilt all that night. Miss Cooper? Did that nice man go away? Hush! Hush, Ruby! Just get a hold of yourself, young woman, and come back down to earth. Shame on you. Mooning around the house this livelong day just hot as a fritter over that mad dog of a preacher. Shame, Ruby, shame! Ruby squatted on the floorboards by the old woman's knees and plucked reflectively at a callus on her long left foot. That man, said little Mary, moon-eyed and scary. He's bad, ain't he, Miss Cooper? Yes, but hush up talking about him, cried Rachel. If we don't think about him, he won't bother us half as much, because it'll all be sun-up directly, and he won't dare to come poking around by daylight. Ruby, run put that coffee pot on. Can we have a coffee? Chimed the small ones. Yes, exclaimed Rachel with brisk sudden cheeriness. I reckon a smidgen of good. Strong coffee would be just all good for us. Go along, Ruby, and heat the pot. The girl padded to the stove in gawky, loose-limbed sullenness and shoved the full pot over the burner and lighted it. John had spoken no word since coming into the kitchen, his eyes fixed now on the night beyond the window screen. Saw now another night by the wharf, and his ears heard again the heels of the hunter ringing clear on the brinks of Peacock Alley in that hour when he and Pearl had fled the world. A mouth thud against the screen then, and Rachel bit her tongue to keep from crying out, and her finger tightened on the warm, flat trigger of the gun, and she said loudly, All right, who'll tell a story? You, they cried unanimously. You tell a story. John pressed forward so that the whole of his right arm was touching hers, and he thought, touching her is like something I forget, something long ago when the whole world was a blue wool blanket and the sun in my eyes, and there was always two faces in the world, only they are faces I can't remember no more. Well, said Rachel, sipping the warm coffee that Ruby had poured for each of them, mind what I told you last Sunday about little Jesus and his ma and pa? They remembered. For how could any of them forget this tale of wanderers, of a no room at where do those wanderers go to? Well, now, there was the sneaking, no-account, ornery King Herod, cried Rachel softly, her lips pursed with indignation. And he heard tell of this little King Jesus growing up. And old Herod figured, well, shoot, there sure won't be no room for both of us. Ain't nobody wants two kings, and that's a fact. I'll just nip this in the bud. Well, he never knowed for sure which one of all them babies in the land was King Jesus, because one baby don't look much different from another. You know that as well as I do. Deep in the brush filth above the north pasture, a rabbit gave a shrill death cry before the soft owl fell from the moon, and she thought, "Deed, it's a hard world for the little things." Rabbits and babies have a time. It's a cruel world to be born into that. And so that cursed old King Herod figured if he was to kill all the babies in the land, every last one, he's sure to be able to get little Jesus and no mistaking. And when little King Jesus' mom and pa heard about that plan, what do you reckon they went and done? They hid in a broom closet, gasped Clary. They run under the wash house, said little Mary. No, said John, they went a-running. Well now, John, that's just what they did done, cried Rachel, angry all over again at what King Herod had done to all these little helpless things. Little King Jesus' ma and pa took and saddled a mule and rode clear down into Egypt land. Yes, said John, and that's where the queen found them in the billy rushes. Pshaw now, scolded Rachel. That warn't the same story at all. That was little King Moses, but just the same, it does seem like it was plague time for little ones, them olden days, them hard, hard times. And she listened to the ticking house and thought, I must keep talking and keep them listening, because that will keep us from thinking about him, because he is out there and he is closer now than I thought, because I can feel it. And crawling stronger now. I can smell it like I can smell burning brush filth in October, even when there ain't no smoke on the sky to mark it. It would have seemed the simplest matter in the world to go to the phone or the hall wall and take down the receiver and crank till Miss Boer answered and tell her to get the state troopers up here quick from Parkersford, and yet this was the last thing that would have entered Rachel Cooper's mind. She had a deep bottomsland mistrust of civil law. If there was trouble at hand, it could most always be settled by the showing of a gun muzzle and a few strong words. A gentle, steady wind rose from the river, and the mist began clearing, and the moon shone bright as twilight. And Rachel thought, now, if I was to blow out the kitchen lamp, I could see it all clear. The whole of my farm from the barn door on the road and the river beyond it. That way I could sight anything moving out there under the apple tree. I could spot him if he should come creeping low under the puzzle tree through the yard towards the kitchen. I sure could tell stories better, she explained to the children, if we was to blow the lamp out. It's always more fun hearing stories in the dark, ain't it now? Yes, they cried, shivering with excitement as the night game Rachel was played. Yes, blow out the lamp. So she cupped her palm against the smoky chimney and huffed once, and suddenly the moonlight came pouring over the windowsill in blue pools at their feet, and in the soft wind an apple thudded dully among the windfalls in the yard. Little Mary, cried Rachel cheerfully, let's hear you do the 23rd Psalm there. And you and me has bout got one learn, ain't we? And little Mary shut both eyes squint tight and commenced lisping the words that Rachel had patiently taught her through the strange and lonely Sabbath nights by the stove. And in her mind Rachel could now see the small, intent face, the fumbling, a racing little tongue trying so hard to say all of those hard words right to please her. He storeth me soul. He leadeth me in path of righteousness. For his name's sake. And the old woman's mouth shaped the words mutely with the child's voice, because when you live for 50 years in a house, you know every sound it is capable of making. And Rachel knew that the faint soft outcry of the floorboards by the marble-top table far and away of the parlor was a sound that never happened unless a foot was there pressed. Yes, she thought, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Yes, she thought, he has come in through the west parlor window that I forgot to latch last Wednesday when I aired the room. Yes, he is in the house with us now, and I dasn't get up to go to the stove for a match to light the lamp again, because I don't know how close he is. In the long, ugly pier glass in the hallway outside the kitchen door, she could see mirrored the dusty square of moon on the dining room floor and thought, when he comes through yonder archway, I will see him no matter how softly he walks, and that's when I'll start pulling the trigger. Come, lambs, she whispered sharply. Come stand close to me. Mind now. They obeyed, and little Mary, disappointed that Rachel interrupted, had spoiled the climax of her recitation, put her thumb in her mouth and sucked it gravely. And then again it might have been Rachel's imagination, the tricks of an old woman's ear, that sound in the room of breathing that was not hers nor the children's, and she had turned her eyes cautiously again to the neglected window just as he spoke distinctly from far end of the kitchen. Figured I was gone, eh? Rachel swung the heavy gun, ready to start pulling the trigger as soon as she was sure where the voice was, hard and steady and angry as a man would have been, and thinking, he's right yonder there behind the spice closet. He closed in from the dining room on his hands and knees so I wouldn't spot him in the pier glass. I will say at least that he ain't no fool about his sneaking. What do you want? She said in a high voice. I want my kids. Yes, she said, I reckon so, but there's more to it than that, mister. There's something them kids know, something they've seen once. What are you after them for, you devil? None of your goddamn business, madam. She ducked her face, whispered among the little faces for an instant. Run, hide in the staircase yonder. Run, quick! And there was a quick scuffle of naked feet as they obeyed, and yet through the corner of her eye, Rachel saw that girl Ruby had not moved, her face suspended like a moonflower in the half-light, like a moth clinging to the gray curtain. Ruby, mind me, get yonder with the rest. Trance-like the girl obeyed, and now Rachel stood alone in the pale arena, the gun level in the crook of her arm. Mister, I'm giving you the count of 3 to get out of that screen door yonder, and if you ain't gone by that, I'm coming across this kitchen and I'm coming to shooting, and I'll blast every witter and joist and shingle out of that end of the kitchen, and you will be dead in kingdoms come. Silence. And the prickle and gather quickened in her flesh, and even as she shaped her mouth for the count, she sensed a motion at her feet, though it seemed no more than the shadow of a leaf on the floor where the moon's square of light ended, a delicate shifting of air and space 1.5 yards from her naked toes, and she knew suddenly that he had stolen that close in that space of seconds, and now he rocketed suddenly upward before her very eyes. His twisted mass caught for one split second in the silver moonlight like the vision in a photograph negative, and she saw the knife in his fist rise swiftly as the bobbin of a sewing machine just as she began pulling the trigger, while the gun bucked and boomed in her hand. After the scream and the thunder, the room rang with echoing stillness, and she saw him reel backward through the affrighted air onto the threshold, screaming again and cursing, then stumble into the broken shadow and light beneath the apple tree in the yard, and up the rough ground toward the open barn. The children in the dark of the staircase had crouched in mute horror throughout all of it, and now they listened as Rachel's footsteps padded to the kitchen door for a moment, and the screen door whined open and fell to again, and they heard her move grumbling into the hallway and crank to wall phone and wait. They heard her tell Miss Boer that she had better send to Parkinsburg for the state troopers and get them out to her place right quick, for she had trapped something up in her barn. Yes, she quarreled in the darkness, banged the receiver back on the hook, and shuffled to the kitchen door again and out the yard to the rocket beneath the tree, where she would begin the moonlight vigil before the barn door where the black figure had disappeared. Yes, and you can just bet those big shiftless county court loafers will track up the clean hall floors to a fare ye well. When morning shot its golden shafts in the mist of the trees in the yard, Rachel stole softly into the kitchen to the stairway for a moment and stared at the children on the steps, filled suddenly with the wonder that each of must feel at least once in his life, the knowing that children are man at his strongest, that they are possessed, in those few short seasons of the little years, of more strength and endurance than God is ever to grant them again. They abide. They huddle together as these children now did, asleep in blessed faith and innocence beneath doom's own elbow. thumbs tucked blissfully between their sweet lips. When the sun broke clear over the Ohio River, Rachel heard the cars in the lane and the voices of the men, and the children heard them too, and awoke and went with her to the fence and saw the gathering cars in the lane beyond the north pasture, saw the men in the tan state police uniforms and the blue-coated city police from Parkersburg. Her hand was wound round John's cold finger, and when Preacher suddenly came staggering out the barn door, she felt the sweat spring in the boy's palm and heard the quick intake of his breath as the blue men stole in from the river's mist and gathered under the branches of the apple tree. "Is that him, ma'am?" "Yes, up yonder in the barnyard. But mind where you shoot, boys. There's children here." "There'll be no shooting if we can help it." Now they moved together towards the man in the barnyard, who did not now seem to see them or care if they came or not. And Rachel towered above her huddled little flock, could not see the boy's face, but heard the hiccuping whimper in his throat as he watched the blue men move solemnly toward the swaying man. Preacher, his left arm hanging useless in his shattered sleeve, the dried blood on his fingertips shining like droplets on a hare's nose when it hangs from a butcher's hook. "Harry Powell, you're under arrest for the murder of Willow Harper." And John felt the scalding urine stream into his socks then and thought, it is then again, and it is him, and it's happening all over again. Or maybe this is happening for the first time, and it was only something I dreamt that night before. Now they're hitting him with sticks again. Yes, and now he is falling down in the grass and trying to cover his head with the arms that ain't hurt. Yes, this is it. Yes, directly the little paper poke with the 5 and 10 presents will fall out on his pocket. And yes, now they will drag him away. John, wait, she cried. But he was gone with the dolly Jenny torn from his sister's arms, and it was in his own now, and he held it out in front of him as he ran toward them, holding it out for them to see. Even the blue men fell back when he came hurling among them and arched above the man in the grass, his child's face twisted and clenched like a fist. Here, screamed, flogging the man in the grass with the limp doll under his arms. Here, take it back. I can't stand it. Dad, it's too much. Dad, I can't stand it. Here, I don't want it. It's too much. I can't do it. Here. And then the blue men seized him gently, and one of them carried him back to the yard, limp and sobbing in his arms. And when all at last they had carried Preacher off to the cars, old Rachel bore the boy upstairs to her own big feather bed and undressed him and kissed his face and tucked him in, little and naked and lost, under the old gospel quilt and she had made when she was the girl in the mountains 60 years before. John thought, they keep asking me to remember all kinds of stuff. The things they don't know is that it was a dream. And when you tell about a dream, it's not all there the way they want it to be. They ask me to questions, and all the people are looking at me, and the man with the gold chain on his vest leans over me and smiles. His breath is like a Christmas fruitcake, and I think, what is it he wants me to say? What stories does he want me to tell? I had a dream once before. You can't remember all the stuff in dreams. So when I started to tell him a little part of it, the rest of it was all gone. When I looked down there at the people, all I could see is Miss Cooper and Pearl and the new doll baby of hers and Ruby and little Mary and Clary, and all I want to do is go home again because it is nearly Christmas. The blue men came. I remember that part of the dream, and they took him away. Who? Well, I'm not so sure about that part, only that he is a man, and the blue men have him shut up in a big stone house up their street from Miss Cooper's sister's house. One day last week, Miss Cooper takes us on the train to Moundsville for this here trial, and what they call it. We're all going to live with Miss Cooper's sister Lovey until the trial is finished, and then we will go home again because it is nearly Christmas. Yesterday it was cold. The snow looked like feathers when Miss Cooper broke the bolster out of the backyard that day. They have this trial, and they keep asking questions. It is a big place called Wellman's Opera House where they show movies. I heard Miss Cooper's sister Lovey say they don't usually have trials here, but they are having this one here because the WPA haven't got done building the new courthouse. When they have this trial, they take you up on a big stage like they was going to put on a show. And all these people are here on the stage, and all those other people down there in the seats are like church. And then the man who smells like fruitcake asks me questions. And then another man with a gold tooth and bad breath, he asks questions too. I can't much figure out what any of it is about except that this fellow with the gold tooth keeps saying something about Bluebird. It seems like this Bluebird has 25 wives and he killed every last one of them, and they've been hunting him now for months and months, and now they got him. I think it's some kind of make-believe story because nobody ever heard of birds with wives. But I do what they want, and I try to figure out what they want me to tell them. Except there is one thing I cannot do. There is a certain place on that stage where I cannot look because I know if I look, something terrible will happen, like I think it did that in that dream. And every time they tell me to look over there at this place, I get all out of breath and I start to shake like I have a bad cold, and then they stop. Maybe sometime I will make myself look, but I am afraid if I do, I will die or something. At night, after Miss Cooper puts us kids to bed, in that big soft feather bed at Lovey's house, I shut my eyes, and after a while I can see it just as plain as day, the man who is there that I am afraid to look at on the stage. But then a funny thing happens, and the next day I can't remember who it was, and I'm afraid to look and see to remember. Pearl talks a whole lot when the men ask her questions. They sit down in the chair and take Pearl on their lap and talk to her real low and friendly, and Pearl tells them all kinds of crazy stuff. Miss Cooper, she talks a lot too, and somebody named Icy and a man named Walt stood up at the back of the crowd yesterday's afternoon and commenced screaming and hollering, and the old man behind the big box told them to shut up, and when they wouldn't shut up, he made the blue men put them people outside in the snow. This here woman Icy put me in mind of a girl I used to know somewhere, but I never seen her and seen the man. Today she got up again and commenced screaming, and some other people started screaming and hollering too. And Miss Cooper taken my hand and held it. I reckon she was scared. This woman they call Icy, she come up on the stage and answer some questions too. And the gold-toothed man talked some more about the bluebird, and I reckon this got her riled up again because she went to shouting some more, and when they made her go back down and sat in the seats with the rest of the people, she commenced hollering over and over again, "Lynch him! Lynch him! He's a murderer!" This court won't never see justice done to that blue bird monster, for he lied, and he taketh the Lord's name in vain, and tramples on his holy book. And directly the old man in back of the box fetched his wooden hammer, and beat on a box for a spell, and he says, "Madam, be silent, or I'll order the court," or something like that. But that don't hold her back, and she hollers out. But he dragged the name of Jesus through the mud, and the old man says, "Madam, we're trying this man for murder, not for heresy." And then this woman, she screams out, "Well, ain't that worse? Taking his holy name in vain and telling us all good Christians he was a man of God." And then she went to screaming with her mouth open so you could see all the pink inside, and the man who was with her started yelling, and all the other men around her did the same thing that I can't even remember what, and with that old man with the hammer told the blue men to put them outside in the street again. Last night we ate peach cobbler for dessert, only I had more than Pearl did, and Pearl cried because there was no more left in the pan, and Miss Cooper said if we was going to act up like that, we couldn't never come visit her sister no more. This is the biggest place I've ever did see. They got lots of houses in this town and this big movie theater, only they ain't holding no movies now. They're holding this here Bluebird trial. Pearl has a new baby doll, which Ms. Cooper bought her at Murphy's 5 and 10 the first day we come here. I just hate it. Every time I look at that doll, I want to take it and break its head. And when Pearl comes to bed, I won't let her take it into the bed with me. And she cries something awful. Sometimes I just think to my soul, I don't know what I'm going to do with Pearl. That's what Miss Cooper says when us kids is ornery. I just think to my soul, I don't know what I'm going to do with you youngins. I love Miss Cooper. She says us kids is the little lost lambs of the shepherd of Galilee. I don't know what it means, but I reckon it's all right. She is so nice except when she makes me wash all the time. Yesterday, there was a bunch of men out in front of the Wellman Opera House, and they was selling little wooden things with strings hanged on them. I thought that was something to catch fish in the river with, and I used to ask Miss Cooper to buy me one, and she pulled me away and said I didn't want one of them shameful souvenirs because that was what called a gallus or something as like that, and we didn't have the 75 cents to throw away. It is cold here. There is this big store across from the courtyard with a toy dog in the window and a great big Victrola record hanging out over the doorway. And they have a big Victrola inside, and every time you walk past, you can hear this feller singing and playing the guitar like they do on the wheeling radio we've been listening to up at Lovey's. Only this fellow sings better and is always the song that goes, "Oh, come and hear my story, my tale of blood and gore. 'Twas down at Crespus Landing along the river shore." Whenever Miss Cooper walks up past the store, there's a bunch of fellers and women standing out in front listening to that song with their faces all kind of serious and crazy. Like when we are right close, they sort of pull back from us like we was dirty or done something bad. And we just walked along and don't pay no minds, but I can still hear this feller singing on the Victrola, and the next part of the song goes, "'Twas there in Marshall County that rainy April day when Bluebird Powell found her, his weak and helpful prey." Sometimes Miss Cooper takes us all to supper at the big hotel across from the Wellman Opera House. I like hamburgers the best. I always eat more than Pearl does, and she gets awful mad. Miss Cooper won't let Pearl take her new doll baby around the dinner table when I'm eating because one time she brought it to the table at Lovey's and I got sick and throwed up on the floor. Today when we walked home from the trial, that lady named Icy and her husband jumped out in front of us like to scare me stiff. She just stood there and stared all goggled-eyed for a moment, and then she struck her finger out and pointed it right at me and Pearl and went to hollering and screaming at all the people around her like she done at the trial. "Them's hers!" she hollered. "Them's her orphans, them poor little lambs of Jesus. Them is the ones he sinned against, my friends, yes, dragging his name through the evil mud of his soul. If the people of Marshall County don't string that bluebird up the pole, then the Christian religion won't never be safe again. He lied. Do you hear me? He fooled us, tricked us with his mealy mouth sermonizing." Miss Cooper says don't pay her no mind because she is more likely one of them Duck River Baptists and probably a Republican to boot, and we just went on home down the street. Halfway home, there is a big stone house, and when we got past it, big old Ruby grabbed Miss Cooper's arm and hollers, "Is that where they got him?" And Miss Cooper says, yes, that's where. And then she pulls us all off down the sidewalk as fast as we can, and I started yelling at old Ruby real loud, "The blue man got him! The blue man got him! The blue man got him!" I like it was some kind of big old joke of something, except I don't know who this is and why they got there in the big stone house. Sometimes I think I can remember who it is, and then the next thing I know, it's all gone. Sometimes it's one face, and then it's another face, and when I dream about the faces, I wake up sweating and grab Pearl and lay there in Lovey's big soft feather bed, and outside I can hear the wind and a big icicle on the juniper tree scraping on the shingles, like when you scratch your fingernails along the window, and I think maybe it ain't an icicle sound at all, but some other kind of sound, like maybe a bluebird singing a terrible, scary bluebird song. This here trial sure is lively, all right. Everyone hollers and carries on. Today they have this old white-haired man named Thomas Steptoe, and he turns a ferry boat on the wharf or something somewhere, and he keeps hollering and yelling that he never done it. Alice blame Bertie, he yells. Every time someone happens, they blame poor old Bertie. If only Bess was still alive. And directly he runs back down into the crowd, and the old man behind the box hollers for someone else to come up and put on a show. I will sure be glad when this trial is done, because then maybe Miss Cooper will take us all to a movie show. Sometimes when I am sitting on a chair up there in the trial, and the man who smells like Christmas is talking to me, I try to think what a movie show must be like. Ruby went once, and she told me all about it. Something wonderful. Is that him, says the man who smells like Christmas. Will you identify the prisoner? And he points, and I look at his finger, and I know he wants me to make my eyes go across the stage from the finger to what he's pointing at, but I can't make my eyes do it. Please, little lad, he whispers, won't you look yonder and tell the court if that the man who killed your mother? Miss Cooper says that when Christmas comes, if I'm good, she will buy me a pocket watch. I hope I'm very, very good, but I don't know if I am or not. A winter dusk. Ruby? Yes'm. Run down to the little store across from the jail and fetch back a pound of butter. I clean forgot when we shopped today, and Lovey Box got something ready. Run along now. Here's 50 cents. Can I go? The children all cry out, and Rachel shushes them because she has told them not to shout, because she realizes what a burden there really is on her sister Lovey, who has bad enough nerves as it is. The children scamper away to the sewing room to play with the bright steel parts of the sewing machine that the old sister has given them as toys during their stay. Ruby pulls out an old coat far too small for her and the ugly toboggan that barely covers her shaggy hair. She moves into the crystal silence of the winter dusk. Down the pavement, the cone clutched in her palm. The wind drifts sharp as a razor. The winter trees are naked and stretched like the fingers of poverty in the gray sky. The blue man, Ruby thinks. John said it was then that they had got him up there in the big stone house yonder. I reckon they won't let him out, or else he would have come to see us again, and maybe he would have told me again about my purty eyes. I love him. She don't understand that he is different from them others, the ones I done the bad things with. She thinks he is just like them, and she don't know how the reason he likes me is because I am so pretty. And I'll bet if he was to get the blue men to let him out at the stone house, he would walk right up to me right now and tell me and ask me to marry him. He would love me, I'll bet, because I love him, and nobody really loves me. Miss Cooper and them kids, I love them, I reckon, but shoot, I am so big and tall, and I don't fit things anymore, and I'm always away, and I lean over. When I am with her, she treats me like them one of her babies, and shoot, I can't be a baby anymore, and I can't be a grown-up, so what does that make me? I used to wonder who I really am, and when I done a bad thing with them boys, I just done it so they would like me, so they would love me. When you are too big for everybody, nothing fits. This coat used to be Clary's, and Clary's is little than I ever was, so whenever I bend over, I have to hold my shoulders up so it won't rip. Rooms, too. Rooms don't fit. People don't fit neither, except him. Well, he don't make fun of me and laugh at me like the other boys used to do, and he don't want to do the dirty thing that the stone house yonder, that's where the blue men got him. She lifted her eyes to the hard yellow windows of the county jail and looked at the little bars, and then she saw the tiny black shape of shoulders and head and thought, that's him now. If I wave my arms, maybe he will see me and come out and we can get married. She stood on the thin ice of the pavement and waved her hand and tried to smile, the pretty smile like the beautiful girls in the movie magazines, because maybe if he saw how beautiful she was again, he would get the blue men to let him come out. He is different. she thought with a delicate smile on her poor mouth, and something stirred softly in the crackle cold of the night, a faint noise of thrashing, like a restless beast moving in the hay of the stable darkness, and she heeded it for a moment and then resumed her reverie, thinking, a body just can't go around with people that don't fit. When I first come to live with Miss Cooper, I was 10 years old, just like Clary, and I had all my clothes in a cardboard carton tied up with a piece of cloth line, just like Clary, and I just sat there on the top of it of Mrs. Cooper's hall, looking at them 2 other kids she had then, before their folks come and took them away, and I thought, why, shoot, this ain't no better, and it ain't no worse. I never fit. But when I see him that night in front of the drugstore, and he'd taken me there and brought me that sody and that book, I known he was different. Why, Miss Cooper, she just take on something awful, but him buying me that there movie book. She was so mad she shot him with her gun, and directly the blue man come and taken him away and put him yonder in the big stone house. She turned her head, cocking it to the wind, as the stir and murmur grew like a faint thunder in the town of her face, screwed up cannily, heeding it, straining to fathom its meaning and wondering. Them's people shouting somewheres, all them people away off somewheres. This sure is the strangest place, the strangest town. And then she shut her eyes and saw his face like it had looked at her in Ev Roberts' drugstore that night, all cruel and beautiful and angry, and she knew more than ever how unlike the others he was, them simpering, slobbering boys on the evening bench, them ones that used to take her down to the pawpaw thicket along the river road and do that bad thing to her. And now, opening her eyes again and turning her head, she saw the bright flames and thought, why, them's just like beautiful red flowers, like the poinsettias Miss Cooper had one Christmas, only that is fire on the ends of those sticks the people are waving, that crowd that is marching up the street from the Wellman's Opera House. They were walking slowly towards the courthouse yard before the jail, and it seemed curiously as if their faces were not moving as slowly as their bodies were, as if indeed the faces were being propelled swiftly before them, the leaping light of the red flambeau. And now they were almost abreast of her in the middle of Tomlinson Avenue, and she could see their faces more clearly and with a particular vividness, the faces of the big man in the lead, the man who waved the rope in his hand and shouted, because it was the husband of the woman who had risen screaming and praying in the back of Wellman's Opera House at the trial, just as she was screaming and praying at her husband's side now. And with a sudden sweet rush of knowing, the girl understood why they were coming. Sure, she thought. They're coming to save him. They're going to make the blue men let him out of the big stone house. And now she turned her eyes to the yellow windows of the county jail again and saw that each square of yellow was swarming with black silhouettes of men now. She turned towards the trees in the yard, and that shout from the courthouse steps beneath the icy branches of the giant sycamores that embraced its ugly sandstone porch, and saw the blue men gathering there with the guns in their hands, and still the saviors with their torches did not stop. Yes, she breathed, save him now, let him free. And she began to run to catch up with them, wishing she had a torch too. And then one of them turned and saw her and gave her a shove toward the pavement and told her to go home and said it wasn't any job for children. And she stood there a moment watching with her dream eyes, and the seething mob circled and moved in cautiously toward the porch under the trees where the blue men were knotted. And she thought, I'll run back and get my things already, my other gingham dress and my shawl and my Mickey Mouse wristwatch that don't run and the straw hat with the flowers, and I'll have them all packed up in that cardboard carton with the piece of clothesline around it, and I'll tell Miss Cooper he's coming to marry me, and she won't mind because she knows it as well as I do. I just don't fit. I don't belong. So she began to run back to Lovey's house, while behind her the breaking hoarse voice of Walt Spoon rose above the gathering chorus of the mob. Because he tricked us! Because he tricked us! Because he is Satan hiding behind the cross!" And the mob roared its affirmation and moved up the steps, and Ruby ran into the house, and old Rachel met her by the umbrella stand saying, "Why, where's the butter? Forevermore, Ruby, where you been?"